Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I'll start. I am honest when I say this is a true story. At least, it's a clear memory for me. When I was a kid, maybe 6 or 7 years old, I had an imaginary friend. Except, I clearly remember him, or it, existing quite clearly, even though the concept of him now seems ridiculous. His name was Melvin, and he lived down the drain. It didn't matter which drain, he was always there, the kitchen sink, the bathtub, everywhere. I never got a good look at him, but that's because it's dark down the drains. My first memory of Melvin, and curiously one of my oldest memories at all, was of hearing a voice while I was taking a bath. It sounded muffled and deep and croaky like a frog, and at first, I couldn't tell where it was coming from until I unplugged the tub and let the water drain out. When the water finally finished draining, I heard the voice again while I was dressing, this time very clearly. It asked me to come and see him. Now, being 8 years old and hearing voices down the drain, I was totally freaked out, but curious at the same time. I approached the tub and looked down the drain, and what I saw there is still burned into my mind. 2 glowing yellow eyes, like cats. For some reason, I don't remember what I did after that. I probably ran to my room or something, I don't know. What I do remember, however, is that for the next 2 or so years I would hear Melvin every time I was alone and near a drain. I would hear it pester me, ask me to come and look at him and talk to him. I never wanted to, but he always convinced me, and I looked down to see the 2 yellow eyes. What did we talk about? Nothing really important. I remember it asking what I like to do and what I like to eat, random stuff like that. I remember telling him about school and other things. It got weird when I started to ask him the questions. I asked who and what he was, but he never got a straight answer. He just said his name was Melvin and he lived down the drain, like always. From time to time, Melvin would tell me that he was hungry, and he needed food, so I would go to the fridge and sneak back random things like crackers or cheese or cereal and pour them down the drain. That didn't make my parents happy, because I got punished a lot for my imaginary pal Melvin. I tried to tell them he was real, but Melvin would never talk when they were around. Well, at this point I would have thought of him as just an imaginary childhood friend, but one thing happened that made me question it. When I was around 7 years old, I was getting out of the bath, and I let the water drain out. Once it did, like usual, Melvin was there asking me to come talk to him. His voice seemed croakier than usual, creepier. I said I didn't want to, but he would pester me, his voice almost screeching in protest until I'd give in and approach the tub. I would sit on my knees on the side of the tub and lean over the edge to peek down the drain, where the yellow eyes were. Melvin told me that night that he was getting tired of living down the drain, and he wanted out and he needed my help. He said I needed to stop running the water or else he would be stuck forever. I told him I needed to use the water, but that just made him mad. I never heard Melvin get so angry. He would start screeching like a dying wild animal, so loud I wondered how no one else in the house couldn't hear him. I tried to tell him to calm down, that I would bring him some good food, but he wouldn't listen. What happened next, I'll never forget. Rising out of the drain was a skinny, bony arm, with a hand on the end spiked with razor-sharp claws. The arm was covered in matted, stinking hair, as if it had been in the water for ages, and the nails had gone yellow. It reached right for me, grabbing me by the arm and started pulling me towards the drain as if to pull me in. All the while I could hear its screeching howl. I screamed as loud as I could, and the next thing I knew, my mom and dad were in the bathroom with me, holding me and asking what happened. The arm was gone. I never heard Melvin after that night. I always wonder, even to this day, if he really existed, or if it was my child brain making things up and he was imaginary. I still am not sure, because that one night comes to mind every time I walk near a drain, and sometimes I'm tempted to look down the drain, but I can't for fear of seeing those bright yellow cat-like eyes.
This happened 5 summers ago when I was 15. At the time I'd just moved to a new area with my parents and brother in a rural town pretty far from any major city, full of hicks and farmer types. One night I couldn't sleep, so I went to the kitchen at about 1 a.m. to get myself a glass of milk. To my surprise, my mother was awake and staring out of the window of our lounge, which looked out onto our front garden and the road ahead of that. "He's here again. He's here again," she kept repeating, turning to face me. She looked at me, but in a way, it felt like she was looking beyond me. "He's here for you, Martin," she said. "My name is not Martin. He was my parents' firstborn son that came out of the womb with an arm's-length list of medical problems, and he passed away just before he was 1 year old and a few years before I was born." I walked into the room to join my mother and to see what the hell she was referring to, and looking out onto the front garden I saw nothing out of place, aside from a few long shadows from neighboring trees. "There's nobody there," I try to explain to my mother, but she remains insistent that she can see someone in our garden. Eventually I sit her down and bring her a glass of milk and go back to sleep. Over the next few months my mother's mental health declined to the point that her living in our house posed a danger not only to her but to all of the rest of the family. About 6 months after the incident, in the night time I was startled to hear a horrific scream mid-afternoon coming from inside our house. My mother had submerged herself in a boiling hot bath, not realizing the temperature of the water, which scalded her body up to her neck. After several more incidents which culminated in my mother holding a knife to my younger brother's throat threatening to sacrifice him for Martin, she was finally institutionalized when I was 16, nearly a year after the first incident. I can assure you this gets worse. My father refused to let either me or my brother visit my mother whilst she was locked away, saying that he didn't want her to influence us in any way with her paranoia bullshit. This did not, however, mean I wasn't contacted by her whilst she was institutionalized. Several weeks after my mother's departure, I awoke suddenly during the night in a horrible cold sweat, feeling like I was going to vomit. I walked through the dimly lit corridors in our house to our bathroom. I switched on the light and was taken aback by our mirror. On it someone had written, "He is here." At first, I thought this was written in blood given the deep red colorization of the font, but it turned out on closer inspection to be written in my mother's lipstick. I was barely able to make a sound before turning on my heels and staggering to my father's room. Stumbling over my words, I was barely able to do justice to what I just saw as I dragged my sleepy father to our bathroom. The light remained on in the bathroom and the old-style oak door had creaked half shut. Light escaped underneath the frame of the door save for the clear outline of 2 feet on the other side of the room. I stood behind my father, pressed against the wall as he crept forward towards the bathroom. Suddenly we both felt this awful static feeling which made our hairs raise and an alarm in my father's room beep. The power in our house died and the bathroom light and my father's bedroom light both made a popping sound before going dark. My father was clearly freaked out by all of this and pushed open the bathroom door. The room was empty. My mother self-ended herself when I was 17. She grew her nails out and used them to pierce an artery in her leg. She bled out and the hospital staff were unable to revive her. My father, who is now an alcoholic, my brother and I all moved across the country when my father received a job offer a short while after this.
When I was a kid around 5 years of age, I lived in an old beat-up house in the boonies with this huge barn in the backyard that was part of the property. This barn was immensely huge, and not a standard barn with just stalls and a room or two. It had a very large foyer-type area with several rooms and a couple of hallways that each lead into their own large compartments. The only rule my parents had set is that none of us children were permitted to go into the room at the very back of the barn. Being 5 years old and terrified of monsters, I heeded their warning religiously. Anyways, one morning I was out with my older brother in the barn. We were shooting our BB guns and exploring the barn while generally just being kids. While fucking around in some hay, me and my brother both heard to what I can only describe as the most terrifying, blood-curdling scream. Even reminiscing about it now sends shivers down my spines and gives me goosebumps. There was no way it was human in origin, but it sounded like no animal I had ever heard. It was ear-piercing. I remember feeling physical pain in my head during the scream, which lasted about 8 to 10 seconds. Needless to say, my brother and I both nearly pissed our pants and sprinted full force back to home. When we got inside, my mom freaked and asked what that noise was. We told her we had no idea and she just told us not to go back out into the barn. Years later I revisited that barn for nostalgia's sake. Being older, and much more ballsy at this point in my life, I decided to check out the forbidden room of the barn. It is still one of the oddest things I've experienced in my life. The barn, mind you, was old and shitty, constructed entirely out of old, rotting wood that was only a windstorm or two from collapsing in on itself. This room, however, was entirely different. Opened the door, lo and behold, everything was metal. Metal flooring, metal walls, metal ceiling with those awful buzzing fluorescent lights installed in the ceiling, though they had long since burnt out. The last thing I noticed was that in the back of the room was multiple wire cages, no larger than 3 cubic feet each. They looked old and were severely distorted and were coated in brown stains, either dried blood or rust. This entire ordeal was way too spooky for me, so I pussed out and got the fuck out of Dodge. Confronted my mother about it and she told me she was aware of the room and the reason she had banned us from entering it was because they believed the previous owners had either cockfights or made drugs in there. However, I still think there may have been a more sinister purpose for that room. That's the only thing that happened in my childhood that still freaks me out to this day.
When I was about 4 to 5, I used to often see the shape of a man walk down the hall and lean against the doorframe of my room. It had a fairly average height and build, and was wearing a hat, but otherwise had no distinguishable clothing or facial features. It was sort of made of darkness or something, like a shadow, but somehow freestanding, instead of being cast onto a surface. It was translucent and sort of sparkly, and its feet seemed to be a few inches off the floor, not so much like it was hovering, so much as that its floor was higher than ours. It never spoke to me or made any movement past my doorframe, and would usually just sort of watch for a while, then walk back down the hallway. But despite the lack of aggression or outright menacing behavior, I still got a bad vibe from it and it freaked me out, especially because for a while, it was showing up almost every night. I told Mom about it, and she varyingly said it was probably just a guardian angel, or my recently deceased grandpa checking in on me, but that didn't seem to chill with the feeling I was getting. After that, though, its visits tapered off and it eventually stopped showing up entirely. I've never seen it since.
I used to have some kind of night terror when I was a kid, a few times. I hadn't had any for years up until about a week ago. I'm 24 now, last one was probably when I was 10. It's hard to describe any visualizations, and I can confirm that I've always been completely awake when they happen. It's just a huge feeling of hopelessly and the true weight of life that hits me at once, and actively affects my consciousness. I will just get shot with the feeling and internal visualization of just being so impossibly small. The thought of death that I and everyone else tends to push out of our mind just comes crashing down upon me, as well as the thought of death for everyone I know and everyone who will exist. How my entire existence will be worth nothing. How the Christian God is, logically, unlikely to be real, leaving a horrid sense of dread for my entire existence. It's not just that I think about those things, I wouldn't be saying this if that's all it was. It's a sensation that I can feel deep within my being, something weird. If I had to describe the visualization it gives me, it feels like you can actively feel the space-time distance between you and anything familiar quickly growing further apart. I've considered panic attack, I don't know.
Get this shit all the time, brother.
Sounds kind of like depersonalization, but I'm not sure if it's exactly the same thing. I used to get this feeling as a child looking into vast distances, like horizons in the cornfields.
I've had something similar most of my life. It almost feels like some force physically hits me and I lose all hope, but it is only for seconds at a time. Also, sometimes when I'm hit with this force I feel like someone close to me has just died. Being hit with this emotion and someone dying has never happened though.
Holy fucking on, I had the same thing too a few years ago, almost one a week. Were dreams about something looming and having a funny vertigo-ish feeling.
Fucked up memories, let's see. The oldest one I remember is, at my grandpa's place. The house was over 300 years old. There was a huge yard behind the house and beyond that, a pond. The first floor was his art gallery and he lived on the second. There was a balcony that was practically a roof, and every morning I'd see the place full of dozens of ravens that were as big as I was 5 or 6 years old. Anyway, the most fucked up thing I ever saw was a giant blue owl. It slowly glided over me and its glowing yellow eyes met mine. By giant I mean the size of a sedan. There are many other weird events, but it would take ages. The next one was something I remembered while going through here. I was 6 or 7 years old and I was at video store to rent some Tom and Jerry VHS. The store had an arcade machine and there was a game that had these robot cat dog-like creatures and you had to go through this maze. I remember actually being in the game, playing the role of one of those creatures. But the thing is, also remember an episode in Tom and Jerry that was similar to that, but the events play out in my head as if I was there. I remember hovering bit like other people and there was this odd memory of me climbing up this whole plane that literally left me in an elevated state. A few inches of the ground. I don't remember anything creepy since I was 9, but for the last 6 months or so I've been hearing children crying or laughing. It happens to me while I am around people or talking to them over the phone, and it will only last for a few seconds. The last one was a few weeks ago. I was feeling really low and I was staring at the bathroom mirror, my head filled with thoughts of how fucked up over the years of my life and why I needed fix shit badly. While I was moving away from the mirror, I noticed my face blur. I took a second look and the same thing happened. The more I tried to focus, the more blurred it got. It was fucked up because the reflection of the rest of my body was just fine.
Okay, so I have a few very weird stories and I'll post some of them and more if people are interested in not having the thread die. First one is where my grandparents used to live before they both died. The house is pretty old, but I don't remember exactly how old. People having lived and died there since before the 1950s is very likely. My grandma died there, but I haven't been to the house since. Maybe if I did, I could initiate contact or something. Do ghosts breathe? One day when I was 7 to 10 years old, I was playing around in the living room. This was very unusual. I don't know why, but most of the time when I played in the living room, my grandma would come in and suggest I find somewhere else to play, and then she would close the door. I knew that the living room was cold, and that had something to do with it, but why the living room was cold is impossible to tell. It was just like all the other rooms in the house, but much colder for some reason. But I was playing in there one day regardless, and nobody had said anything to me. I remember it was a summer day, but I wore warm clothes because else I'd freeze, even though the radiators were running at full warmth. I felt a bit uncomfortable with the cold, but I had begun to feel conscious about playing with toys in front of people, so I wanted to not be interrupted, and I stayed in there for God knows how long. However, the feeling of being uncomfortable kept on growing, and at one point I simply stopped playing, so I just sat there for a second, and then I heard it. Heavy Darth Vader-like breathing seemingly coming out of nowhere. I remember holding my own breath out of shock. I was too scared to move. Something was breathing right behind me, breathing heavily right behind my back. I sat there for eternities before finally turning my head around, and nothing was there. Nothing but the sound of heavy breathing. I went out and told my grandma, but she said I must have heard my own breathing. Of course, I knew I had held my own breath and still heard the creepy heavy breathing. I went back to the living room to continue playing, since my dad always told me that if he wasn't scared, I shouldn't be scared either, and I lived by that rule most of my childhood. Every time something scared me, like if the darkness scared me, I would just think not to be scared as long as my dad wasn't, and that would comfort me. I went back in there to find the breathing had stopped. I was relieved and thought I had been hearing things that weren't there, so I continued playing with my toys, but after a while, the breathing began again. This time, despite my fear, I went straight out and told my grandma to come and hear it. Of course, when she came in, the breathing had stopped. She looked at me and said I must have heard my own breathing, then she went out and right then the breathing started again. I told it to stop. It didn't do it right away, but then after some time though, it disappeared completely. However, I was still scared it might come back, so I went out of there and never returned alone. Blue head scares my cousin. This is a rather short one, that I can't be too descriptive about since it didn't happen to me, but I know it scared my cousin shitless, which is why even with the little amount of details I have, it still manages to scare me, because I saw how afraid she was. This happened when she was 7 or 8 years old, too. Me and my cousin would often sleep over at my grandma's, but rarely at the same time though. One day, my cousin didn't want to go there anymore though, because as she had been falling asleep, all of a sudden, the closet would slowly creak open, and a man with a blue head would peek out at her. Then he would stare at her until she passed out early in the morning. This is how my cousin spent many sleepless nights at my grandma's when she was around 7 to 8. We also have some scary things happening internally in my family though. I foresee my grandpa's dead. This was in 2004 or 2005, when my grandpa died. We were returning from a vacation in Tunisia, but when we were to return from there, the flight suddenly got delayed by 12 hours without any explanation at all. As we were waiting in the airport to be escorted to a hotel where we could stay until the airplane was ready, my aunt's phone rang. At that exact moment I knew somehow that my grandpa had died. As she spoke on the phone she started crying. I remember, even though feeling my grandpa's death, that I thought to myself, their house probably burnt down or something. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that he had died. So, without having gotten any information about the conversation, I went out and found my dad who had gone in the airport, and told him with confidence that his dad had died. Just as if I knew it somehow. When I returned with my dad, I sent my cousin, who was also there, a comforting smile. She didn't know I knew since I was away when my aunt told everyone what had happened during the call, so she looked at me like I was an asshole for smiling and said, "You do know that our grandpa's just dead, right?" And I just nodded slowly and hugged her. She must have been hella confused. My dad didn't know I hadn't actually heard from a valid source that he was dead until then, and everybody was just really sad and confused, being stuck in an African airport while their family members passed away, so nobody ever questioned how I knew. However, I have a feeling that my grandpa gave me that feeling right after his death because he thought I would be a great carrier of the sad news that he had passed away. He wanted me to tell my dad. I have no idea why I feel this, but the thought is comforting, I guess because it makes me feel like I had a purpose or something. You do know that our grandpa's just dead, right? I meant to say, you do know that our grandpa has just died, right? God damn it, I'm sick. Anyway, my grandma foresees her own death. Another short but interesting story. My grandpa died like a week or two before his 71st birthday, and then exactly half a year later, we went to where he was buried. We were talking about how if he was still alive, we would have a birthday to celebrate half a year from now. My grandma turned to us with a creepy expression of great sadness and said, "Yes, you too would. But not me. I'm not going to live that long." "Come on," said my dad, "you don't know about that." "Yes, I do. I'm not even going to be seeing next week," she told us. We decided we wouldn't talk to her about that, but it didn't feel like she was just saying shit like because she had gotten old or something. She was only 64 after all. And exactly 4 days later, she died in her home and nobody knew why. I'm guessing it was just the deep grief that my grandpa had passed away. The week after that though, we were supposed to eat at her place. When she was found dead, her hand was in a position like she was trying to count how many people we would be at the dinner. Was she still thinking of us in her last moments, even though she knew she wouldn't live that long?
Grandma predicts own death. No one knows how she died. You feel it was out of grief. Hand held out in a position like she was counting who was coming to dinner. Your grandma committed self-end via ingesting pills and your family hid the secret.
When I was 6 or 7, my family lived in Arnold, Nebraska. The only house we could get at the time was on a pig farm 9 miles away from town, and about 8 miles from anything else. The owners used to live in the house we lived in, but they ended up building a bigger one closer to town. Anyways, the only time I remember there ever being pigs on the farm is during the fall. I don't know why, and I never really thought to ask, but there was never anything but us on the farm until fall. Well, one summer night I was woken up by a loud noise outside. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, so I wanted to see what it was that was loud enough to wake me up. I climbed off the top bunk, careful not to wake my sister. We shared a room, and I walked out of our room and towards the front door. I opened the door and stepped outside and started walking down the sidewalk towards the gate to the fence that surrounded our house, and I saw someone. I walked closer to him, being stupid and only 6. He was no one I knew or had ever seen before. He was lean, and he was wearing an ordinary t-shirt and jeans, but they were spattered with black. He had black hair and a cut or gash that went from under his right eye down to his jaw, and it was bleeding a little bit. When I looked closer at his face, I noticed there was just something off about his eyes. I don't even know how to describe it. He was breathing super heavy, like he'd just gotten in a fight or something, and he was carrying an axe with a reflective head with his left hand, which made me step back a bit. He hefted the head up to hold it with both hands, looked at me, sniffed and said sternly, "Go back inside." I ran back inside, locked the door, and ran to my room and hid under the covers. I honestly still have no idea what to make of it.
I used to feel like I could fly. Well, not fly, more like hover in the air for a few seconds. I would used to jump off the stairs from 4 to 5 steps up from the floor and feel like I was hovering. I remember once I jumped down and hovered all the way to the kitchen before hitting the ground. I know a lot of other people have this memory.
This when jumping off the swings at the park with my friend. Same exact thing, we too referred to it as hovering.
Me too. I vividly recall once when I was small running as fast as I could and jumping over lava, aka a rug. Then I realized I hadn't hit the ground yet. Took 2 or 3 seconds after the realization for me to land. Has never happened again.
I think all children could fly or hover at some point when our innocence and pure positive energy was still intact. We are full of love at this point, so much that we can float. Anyone read the Celestine Prophecy books? That is what my personal theory is on this topic.
I used to always have dreams as a kid that I could hover. I used to belly flop to the floor, then be suspended a little bit off the floor, like a magnet. Those dreams used to feel so real. I used to wake up and think, maybe I can actually hover, but never have the balls to do it.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.